The way banks originally approached this business was from the standpoint. Now, keep in mind that when leverage leasing started getting traction in the middle to late 70s, the length of the deals started out to be 12-year deals. Then they got to be 15, 18, and then 20, and sometimes beyond 20-year deals. And so what the bank was looking at is if you take a look at the original airline deals, and we were going from propellers to jets, and it was a 12-year deal, generally speaking, very low to zero residual risk in the transaction. And at the end of 12 years, the value of that airplane was at least as much as it was at the beginning. And so lessors were making a killing. They'd put the money out, and in those years, I think the depreciation was a little faster. So let's just leave it at 7 years for the moment. 7 years later, you got your entire equity investment back, and then you would get as much as 100% residual realization at the end of the lease term. Well, banks were in love with this sort of thing. And it was basically the brokerage community that kept telling the lessee, gosh, guys, you're leaving an awful lot of money on the table, and said, well, let's take the term out. Let's start in a competitive environment and get these guys to put a little more residual risk into it. And so gradually it continued to move up until it reached what was then a Reg Y cap of 25%. And increasingly, the competitive landscape became, how close to 25 are you willing to go in order to win this transaction? Okay. Of course, this is before the TBTs, and TBTs changed the landscape.
TBTs?
Yes, tax benefit transfer deals changed the landscape of leasing because it brought in a much broader avenue, a variety of lessors.
Is that what started the tax shelter type business and put it into high gear?
I don't know that it started the tax shelter business because there was an awful lot of business being done with doctors, lawyers, and Indian chiefs. Okay. If you remember National Railway Utilization Corp., and otherwise known as NROC, there were a lot of railroad deals that were done just purely for tax shelter purposes. But from a bank standpoint, this tax benefit transfer business that was done just to swap tax benefits, not particularly for ownership of assets,
right,
brought in credit companies and industrial companies that heretofore had not really been in the business.
Right.
They looked at this, looked at the returns they were getting, and said, this isn't a bad way to shelter our tax bill. And so all of a sudden the likes of Beatrice, Philip Morris, trying to think of other industrials that came into the market. The market was literally flooded with new equity sources. Dart and Craft was another one. It just became very crowded very quickly.
Sure.
And so, go ahead.
Then I was going to ask you, the repeal of ITC in 1986, I think under Reagan, was that a kind of the beginning of the end of the tax shelter business, or the end of the tax shelter business, correct?
Yeah, I think that it set the tone. Let's put it that way. It set the tone for what the Hill was interested in doing economically. As the envelope continued to get pushed out in terms of more risk, longer term, things like that, Congress was looking for ways to limit and bracket the business. And the first real serious volley was the elimination of ITC, because although you were getting all of your equity back in whatever the depreciation period was for that time, in reality, the day you signed that lease, you were getting a combination of depreciation and ITC that would give you about 20+% of your money back that day.
Right.
So, I mean, banks just love this stuff.
Sure. Much like energy tax credits today, right?
Yeah. Yes. Same idea. And so, in this case, though, it sort of set the pole for Congress saying, you know what, guys, we understand you are all, pretty clever structuring people and so forth. But this, we're trying to bracket you guys and push you, back into a position where if you're going to get those kinds of returns, you really need to take more risk.
In
And
a
so,
in an interview with Mike Fleming, he helped me go back a little bit, which will be coming up here in the future, in terms of what really stimulated the equipment leasing market that you and I know it today anyway.
mhm.
Back and I didn't get into the industry personally until around the 83 time frame, 81, 83 time frame. And at that point in time, investment tax credit was around, but I had no recollection of when it was actually instituted and when the whole safe harbor tax shelter business of leasing started. Can you give us a little idea of your recollection when that all started to take place?
Well, actually, a lot of that took place way before I got into business. If I'm not mistaken, I think FASB 13 goes back into the late 60s. And I don't think the business really got serious traction until, somebody figured out that they could reduce their borrowing rate significantly by doing a leverage lease. So if, in those days, your borrowing rate was, you could probably reduce your effective cost of borrowing by 700 or 800 basis points as a lessee by leasing the equipment instead of going to the bank and borrowing to buy the equipment. And so a lot of lessees, not only because I happen to have been in the rail industry, but a lot of lessees in that business were shippers and needed the equipment because we had control of the equipment. We could force them, in effect, to accept the lease rather than the purchase.
Okay.
But then, of course, the airlines came along, and as we got, the 707 was really sort of the big airplane to move a lot of people and introduce you to the jet age. But it wasn't until the 727 was developed that the airline industry had now the tools to get into smaller airports. The 707 needs a 10,000-foot runway to stop itself because it doesn't have the technology that the new big airplanes have to stop. And so they couldn't get into Kansas City and other smaller towns.
Right.
It's the advent of the 727 that opened up all of America to the jet age.
And commercial leasing, equipment leasing on a commercial aircraft really took off at that point.
Yeah, and of course, once they deregulated the industry, then it was Katie bar the door, because it was the equivalent of the Oklahoma land rush, where everybody was lined up. Deregulation hit, and whoever could get out there and claim those city pairs and dominate those city pairs became the winner. And of course, if you're going to go out and do that, you need a lot of equipment. Okay. And so, as we are in a position today, the airlines need new airplanes, and the leverage lease was soup du jour financially.
Colorful stories that you might share with us about the culture and deals in the earlier days of leasing. Not that you're an old fella, but I'm talking about in the 70s and 80s. That kind of gives the people today a glimpse through a story of what deals were like and what the environment was like.
Well, the deals tended to be small, as I indicated, and somewhere around the early 80s. We started to get into larger transactions. And when I was at First Chicago, we had an opportunity to bid on a $650 million transaction. Now, this was the biggest deal that First Chicago had ever seen, and we were going to underwrite this thing. And so
I was worth $1 million.
Pardon me?
That's when $1 million was worth $1 million.
Oh yeah, it was a electric generation plant called I think it was Antelope Valley 2 or something for Basin Electric out in I think North Dakota. And we rounded up equity. We had 4 or 5 equity participants in this thing and put our bid in. Well, when the lessee had the beauty contest, because in those days you would have a beauty contest. All the lessor groups would go in and present their case and present their terms and conditions, and then the broker would advise the lessee as to which set of terms and conditions and economics, that mix was the most attractive, and that group would win. except that in this particular case, they wanted to know if that was firm equity or if every one of the people that we had lined up to be a lessor was in turn going to sell their position down. And of course, every one of them wanted us to do that for them. And so we said, no, we're going to underwrite this, but these five equity are part of our underwriting, and then we intend to sell off beyond that. Well, the lessee said, I want the five of you, six of you to be firm, and that's it. And we said, well, that's too big of a chunk for each one of us to take on individually. We're going to have to sell these down. And of course, we lost that transaction because another lessor stepped in and said, I'll take the whole thing, lock, stock, and barrel.
And that was?
Philip Morris. They were a very formidable lessor because they had an enormous appetite. But that business was highly competitive, very intense in the competition as you got closer and closer through these beauty contests. It really was a lot of fun. It was very exciting.
Amazing. It's hard to even, that's a big deal, a huge deal even in today's standards. Going back then, that had to be just gigantic of a transaction.
Well, now, in this recent history, when the Lilos and Silos came through, those deals were pretty much typical. A typical Lilo or Silo could be anywhere from, $200 or $300 million up to $1 billion or more dollars. And so, it was interesting to see how the industry evolved from doing, 10, 15, $20 million leverage leases all the way up to $1 billion leverage leases.
Now, again, as I mentioned early on, we first started this interview. There aren't many people in our industry that they'd be lying if they didn't say they would have loved to participate in at least one big transaction of that type. But very few of us, will have ever had any, will have ever done one in our careers. And we live vicariously through you and others like you. And so I think just talking to you about these and having you explain some of these transactions to us, I think it's very helpful.